Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a fascinating topic, Victorian breakfasts. Now, you might think a breakfast is just about cereal or toast, but in Victorian England, breakfast was more than a simple meal, it was an event, a ritual, and a window into society's class divisions. Picture this, it's a chilly morning in 19th century London, and across the city, from grand estates to modest cottages, people are preparing for the day ahead. The wealthy are sitting down to a lavish spread, while the working class folk are likely scraping together something simpler. Breakfast in Victorian times wasn't just about food, it was about status, tradition, and setting the tone for the day ahead. You probably won't survive without hearing about the extravagant, and sometimes bizarre, breakfasts the Victorians enjoyed, so sit back and relax. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Victorian breakfasts were far more elaborate and formal than our modern morning routines. Imagine towering spreads of meats, fruits, eggs, pastries, and, of course, tea, all arranged on a grand table. Breakfast wasn't just about nourishing the body, it was a statement. For the upper classes, breakfast set the tone for their entire day, and how you ate it, what you ate, and who you ate with were all loaded with meaning. It wasn't just food, it was a ritual that defined the day's rhythm. Today, we're going to explore the extravagant breakfasts of the wealthy and the more modest morning meals of the working class, the rise of new breakfast foods, and the surprising impact of the Industrial Revolution on breakfast culture. Ready? Let's dig into the details of what Victorian breakfasts were really like. In Victorian England, breakfast wasn't just the first meal of the day, it was an event. For the upper classes, breakfast was the ceremonial start to a day that could be filled with business, social engagements, and often lavish gatherings. It wasn't simply about sustenance, it was a ritual, a time to show off wealth, status, and taste. This was the time when the elite gathered in their grand dining rooms, typically over a table covered with fine china, silver cutlery, and a spread of extravagant dishes. Breakfast in the Victorian era symbolized the beginning of a productive day, where class distinctions were very much on display. Imagine yourself as part of the upper crust, sitting down in a well-appointed dining room, the scent of fresh brewed tea filling the air. The table is laden with a variety of foods, soft-boiled eggs, buttered toast, honey, jams, pastries, cold meats, perhaps even a delicate fish dish or two. Every dish is served with ceremony, and the pace of the meal is slow, nothing rushed. This isn't a grab-and-go breakfast, it's a leisurely event that sets the tone for the day ahead. In the presence of their family or guests, the upper class were afforded the time and space to discuss matters of business, politics, or even gossip. It was as much a social occasion as it was a meal. For the working class, however, breakfast was a very different affair. It wasn't the leisurely event enjoyed by the elite. Instead, it was quick and utilitarian, often consisting of simple foods that could fuel long hours of labor. But even in these humble meals, the social structure of Victorian England was clear. The working class breakfast might have been more modest, but it was no less significant in the rhythm of the day. It wasn't about indulgence or excess, it was about sustenance, getting people energized for the hard work ahead. Historians still argue over the social functions of breakfast in Victorian England. Was it a form of power, used to showcase wealth and social status? Or was it, in the grand scheme, just a practical necessity that happened to align with the values of the time? Some scholars suggest that breakfast became a status symbol in and of itself, with those who had the luxury of time and resources able to enjoy it as a leisurely event. Others point out that while the rich enjoyed their elaborate meals, the working classes were equally dependent on their own routines, even if they had less variety or indulgence in their morning meals. As you settle into a peaceful state of rest tonight, think of the morning meals of the past, the clink of silverware, the laughter and conversation around a well-laid table, and the way breakfast could define the entire rhythm of the day. Whether it was an elaborate spread for the elite or a humble but hearty meal for the workers, breakfast was more than just food, it was an experience, a moment where the world could take shape for the hours ahead. In Victorian England, tea was more than just a beverage, it was an essential part of breakfast. For the Victorians, tea wasn't simply something you sipped casually in the morning, it was woven into the very fabric of their daily routine, signaling the beginning of the day. In fact, tea became such an important fixture in Victorian life that it's hard to imagine a breakfast without it. Whether the meal was grand and elaborate or simple and quick, tea was the unifying factor that bridged all social classes and established breakfast as the day's first event. For the wealthy, tea was prepared with the utmost ceremony. The finest loose-leaf teas, often imported from China or India, were brewed to perfection and served in delicate china teacups, often accompanied by elegant milk and sugar. The tea ritual in the morning was a pause from the frantic pace of the court and social obligations. It was a moment of calm, a small but significant part of the breakfast experience. And, of course, it wasn't just tea that was served, it was often accompanied by pastries, soft-boiled eggs, and perhaps even a bit of fruit or marmalade. Tea was central to the day's pace, and its preparation was as much an art as it was a ritual. Tea also played a pivotal role in the working-class breakfast. For many Victorians, tea was the first hot drink of the day and a necessary pick-me-up before heading off to the factory or fields. For the working class, however, tea was often less ceremonial and more functional. It wasn't about the delicate flavors of imported tea leaves or ornate teacups, it was about getting the necessary caffeine boost to start the day. Some working-class families might have enjoyed a simple cup of tea with a slice of bread and jam, while others would mix it with milk or sugar to add some richness and sustenance. Tea for the working class wasn't a luxury, it was a comforting, warming drink to help endure the day ahead. Interestingly, the rise of tea drinking in the Victorian era has been tied to the expansion of British colonialism. As Britain's empire grew, so too did its control over tea-producing regions like India and Sri Lanka. This brought tea to the masses, making it an accessible luxury, especially for the middle and upper classes. Historians still debate whether tea was truly a symbol of British superiority and colonial power, or if it simply became a part of the everyday British lifestyle due to its ability to bring people together. In either case, the cultural importance of tea in Victorian England can't be overstated. Some scholars even argue that tea drinking during breakfast became a symbol of social status, with the wealthy indulging in the finest tea and the working class opting for more affordable options. This marked the beginning of a tea culture that would last for generations, influencing not just breakfast, but also afternoon tea and the overall rhythm of the British day. Whether served in a gilded porcelain cup or a simple mug, tea was the drink that set the tone for the day and acted as a catalyst for other activities. For now, as you settle in for a restful night, picture yourself in Victorian England, sipping a warm cup of tea as part of your breakfast ritual. Imagine the comforting aroma of the tea filling the room, setting the mood for the day. The ritual of tea was not just about the drink itself, it was about the act of pausing, enjoying the moment, and starting the day with intention and connection. Much like the Victorians, we too find comfort in our morning rituals, even in something as simple as a cup of tea. Now that we've discussed the essential role of tea in the Victorian breakfast, let's delve into the hearty meals that made breakfast a grand occasion for the upper classes. For the wealthiest Victorians, breakfast was not a simple affair. It was a lavish event, often involving multiple courses and an extravagant spread. This was not just a meal, it was a social ritual, an opportunity to indulge in the finest foods and to display one's wealth and status. The grandeur of these breakfasts reflects the opulence that defined the lives of the Victorian elite. Imagine sitting in a large, sunlit dining room in a sprawling estate, the scent of freshly brewed tea mingling with the aroma of sizzling bacon and eggs. The table is covered with an assortment of food, piles of hot buttered toast, delicate pastries, savory sausages, crispy bacon, and a variety of cheeses. Eggs might be served in several forms, boiled, scrambled, or even poached, each dish prepared to perfection. At some tables, you might find fish, such as kippers, or perhaps a slice of game meat, adding a touch of luxury to the morning meal. The key to the Victorian upper-class breakfast was its richness. Unlike the lighter, quicker meals that marked the day for the working class, the elite indulged in a spread that could fuel them for hours. This meal was typically consumed in the comfort of home, without the rush of modern work schedules. Breakfast for them wasn't just about nourishment, it was a way to connect with family and guests, a way to start the day in a relaxed, refined environment. A large breakfast often set the tone for a day of leisurely activities, business discussions, or social visits. However, breakfast wasn't just about food. The entire ritual of the meal spoke to the sense of importance the upper classes placed on this time of day. Guests might gather for a formal breakfast, where conversation flowed easily and leisurely. The meal could last for an hour or more, with no rush to finish. The table would often be set with silverware, fine china, and crystal glasses, creating an atmosphere of luxury that was just as important as the food itself. Breakfast was about making a statement of wealth, sophistication, and comfort. Historians still argue over whether the Victorian elite's lavish breakfasts were about more than just indulgence. Some suggest that these meals were a reflection of the hierarchical nature of Victorian society, where the upper class sought to demonstrate their superiority through luxury. Others believe that these breakfasts were more about maintaining a social order, a way to reinforce class divisions while also providing an opportunity for business dealings or political discussions. Either way, the Victorian upper-class breakfast was as much about the cultural and social practices surrounding the meal as it was about the food itself. One thing that's clear is that the wealthier Victorians treated breakfast as an experience, one to be savored and enjoyed. For them, breakfast was more than just the start of the day, it was a leisurely ritual that offered a chance to relax, connect, and indulge in the finest foods available. And while many of these extravagant breakfasts might sound excessive to us today, they were the standard for the upper classes during the Victorian era. They reflected not only the wealth of the household but also the values and social expectations of the time. As you drift into your own peaceful slumber tonight, think of the lavish Victorian breakfasts, the sound of conversation, the clink of fine china, and the rich aroma of a meal that sets the tone for the day ahead. Imagine the grandeur of the Victorian dining rooms, where every meal was a statement of luxury, tradition, and social status. And, much like the Victorians, we too can appreciate the importance of our daily rituals, even if our breakfasts are a bit simpler. While the upper classes were indulging in extravagant, multi-course breakfasts, the working class had a very different approach to their morning meal. Breakfast for the working class wasn't about luxury or indulgence, it was a practical, no-frills affair designed to provide the energy and sustenance needed for a long day of work. For the laborers, farmers, and factory workers of Victorian England, breakfast was typically simple, quick, and filling, reflecting the values of efficiency and practicality that characterized their daily lives. Imagine yourself in the modest home of a working-class family in Victorian England. The kitchen is small, the furnishings plain, but the smell of hearty porridge or a slice of bread with cheese fills the air. There's no silverware or fancy table settings, just a rough-hewn wooden table, a few bowls, and a simple mug of tea. The food, though not as lavish as the spreads enjoyed by the upper classes, is comforting and substantial. It might consist of a thick slice of bread, buttered or with jam, a bowl of porridge made from oats or barley, and perhaps a boiled egg or some cold meat if the family is fortunate. For the working-class Victorian, the meal was not a time for indulgence, it was simply fuel for the day ahead. In fact, for many in the working class, breakfast was often eaten in a rush. There was no time to linger over a leisurely meal. With the demands of early factory hours or physical labor, people had to get up early, eat quickly, and get to work. Some workers would even eat breakfast standing up or while walking to their jobs. The idea of spending a long time at the breakfast table simply didn't fit into the rhythm of their day. Meals like porridge or bread with cheese were cheap, easy to prepare, and filling enough to keep the workers going through a long shift. Tea, of course, remained an important part of the working-class breakfast. For many, a hot cup of tea in the morning was a ritual that helped them get through the early hours of the day. Tea was inexpensive and widely available, and it was often the drink of choice for the working class. It provided a boost of warmth and comfort, especially on cold mornings, and helped them prepare mentally for the long day ahead. A few workers might have enjoyed a sweet pastry with their tea, but in general, breakfast for the working class was focused on getting enough energy to power through a demanding day. Historians still debate the nutritional value and health impact of the working class breakfast. Some suggest that while it was sufficient to sustain workers through their shifts, the diet lacked variety and essential nutrients. A diet consisting mostly of bread, porridge, and tea, though filling, might have lacked the vitamins and minerals needed for long-term health. Others argue that the simplicity of the working-class breakfast was a reflection of a society that prioritized labor and productivity over leisure or indulgence. The working-class meal was less about taste and more about function. It was food designed to fuel the body for work, not for enjoyment. Even so, the working-class breakfast was a moment of comfort in the midst of a hard, often exhausting life. While it lacked the grandeur of the upper-class breakfast, it had its own sense of tradition and routine. For many families, breakfast was the only meal they had time to enjoy together before everyone scattered off to work. And in a way, it was a quiet ritual that helped define the start of the day, giving the workers a brief moment of rest and sustenance before the grind of the day took over. As you settle in tonight and think about the simplicity of the working-class breakfast, imagine the humble kitchens and the quiet comfort of a meal that was as much about practicality as it was about tradition. Whether it was a slice of bread, a bowl of porridge, or a hot cup of tea, these breakfasts were the fuel that helped the working-class Victorians get through their long, hard days. While their meals were not as indulgent as those of the wealthy, they were just as essential in shaping the rhythm of their lives. As we continue to explore Victorian breakfasts, it's fascinating to see how the foods that were once considered rare or exotic began to rise in popularity and become staples on breakfast tables across England. The 17th and 18th centuries had seen some of the earliest shifts in how people viewed their morning meals, but it was during the Victorian era that breakfast really began to evolve, with new foods being introduced and gaining popularity. What once was a simple, functional meal soon became an opportunity for innovation, and some of the breakfast foods that are familiar to us today first made their mark during this time. One of the most important developments during the Victorian era was the increasing popularity of porridge and oatmeal. While these foods had been staples in England for centuries, it was in the Victorian period that they really came to prominence as part of the everyday breakfast. Oats were inexpensive, widely available, and easy to prepare, making them an ideal choice for families of all classes. For the wealthy, porridge might be served with cream or fruit, while the working class often ate it plain or with a dollop of butter or sugar. The rise of porridge also came at a time when the idea of health foods was gaining traction. Victorian society had begun to embrace the idea of a balanced diet and nutritional benefits, and porridge, with its wholesome, filling nature, was seen as a healthy way to start the day. It was often promoted as a cure for everything from indigestion to poor circulation. Porridge, in the Victorian context, became more than just a breakfast, it was a statement of health and vitality. Along with the rise of porridge, another Victorian breakfast staple emerged: eggs. Eggs were a common and versatile food that could be prepared in numerous ways: scrambled, boiled, poached, or fried. Eggs quickly became a central part of breakfast menus, especially among the upper classes. For the wealthier Victorians, eggs were often served with meats like bacon or sausage, while simpler versions might feature eggs alone, perhaps with a piece of buttered toast on the side. The introduction of new breakfast foods also reflected the growing influence of technological advancements in food production during the Industrial Revolution. With new methods of food processing and preservation, items like bacon, sausages, and even canned goods became more accessible and affordable for many families. Bacon, once considered a luxury, became a common feature on breakfast tables, especially among the upper classes. Its popularity grew as it could be easily prepared, stored, and served alongside other breakfast items. Historians still debate whether the increasing availability of processed foods during the Victorian era was a benefit or a detriment to health. Some argue that the rise of convenient breakfast foods, like sausages or preserved meats, contributed to unhealthy eating habits that would later have negative health consequences. Others believe that these new foods, along with the rising popularity of nutritious options like porridge and eggs, created a more balanced and diverse breakfast culture. Either way, the foods that became staples during the Victorian period left a lasting impact on how we approach breakfast today. As we consider the evolution of breakfast foods, we also have to acknowledge the role of the growing middle class during this period. The expansion of the middle class, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, meant that more people had access to a variety of foods that were once considered the domain of the elite. Breakfast, once an affair reserved for the wealthy, became more democratized. The working class, too, began to enjoy breakfast foods that were previously out of reach, like porridge, eggs, and meats. Even though their breakfasts remained more modest than those of the upper classes, the availability of these foods marked a shift in the food culture of Victorian England. As you settle into your own quiet space tonight, consider how the evolution of breakfast foods during the Victorian era mirrors the changes in society itself, how new opportunities, inventions, and ideas shaped not just what people ate, but how they saw food and health. Just as the Victorians found new ways to enjoy their morning meals, so too do we continue to evolve in our own ways of eating and understanding food. Maybe, as you drift off, you'll think about your own morning ritual, whatever it may be, and how it connects you to the cycles of tradition, health, and comfort that are shared by people across time. In the Victorian era, the use of fresh fruit and produce at breakfast was more than just about flavor, it was about luxury, health, and the growing sophistication of English breakfast culture. Fresh fruit wasn't something that could be easily obtained by all Victorians. For the wealthy, the morning meal often included a variety of fruits, such as oranges, apples, strawberries, or even exotic fruits like bananas, which were becoming more accessible due to expanding trade routes. However, for those in the working class, fruit was a rarer treat, often reserved for special occasions rather than a daily breakfast staple. For the upper classes, the inclusion of fresh fruit at breakfast was an opportunity to showcase not just their wealth but also their adherence to the latest trends in nutrition. The Victorian era saw a burgeoning interest in health and well-being, influenced in part by new ideas about food and digestion. Fresh fruit was considered an important part of a balanced meal, providing necessary vitamins and a sense of freshness that complemented the richer, heavier components of a typical Victorian breakfast. The display of fruits like oranges, which had once been a rare and exotic delicacy, became symbols of sophistication and refinement. Oranges were particularly prized in Victorian England, symbolizing not only wealth but also the refinement of one's palate. They were a luxury item, and often, only the wealthiest could afford them regularly. For the middle and working classes, oranges were more of a seasonal indulgence, available in the colder months, when imported fruits were more accessible. But for those who could afford them, oranges were part of an extravagant breakfast, enjoyed with tea or used to flavor other dishes, from sweet cakes to marmalade. Historians still argue about how much of the interest in fresh produce during the Victorian period was genuinely rooted in health and how much was simply about emulating the upper class. Some scholars believe that the obsession with fresh fruit and vegetables was an early form of the wellness movement, driven by the growing understanding of nutrition and digestion. Others suggest that it was more about status, consuming exotic fruits and having fresh produce at every meal was a way to demonstrate one's wealth and social standing. Regardless of the underlying motivation, fruit became an important component of the Victorian breakfast, offering a touch of freshness and a visual indication of opulence. For the working class, fresh fruit at breakfast was far less common. If it appeared at all, it was likely a small piece of seasonal fruit, perhaps an apple or a few berries. With the demands of long working hours and the economic strain faced by the working class, fresh fruit was a luxury that many simply couldn't afford. Instead, their breakfasts were more focused on hearty, filling items that could provide energy for a long day's work. However, in some homes, the occasional treat might be had, like a single piece of fruit, perhaps purchased from a local market or farm stand. The role of fresh produce, especially fruit, in Victorian breakfasts also tells us about the broader economic and social changes occurring during the period. The rise of trade and transportation, particularly with the expansion of the British Empire, brought new foods to England. Fruits like bananas, pineapples, and even exotic citrus fruits from the Mediterranean became increasingly common. This shift was a direct result of advancements in global shipping and the creation of better infrastructure, which allowed for quicker and more efficient transportation of goods across continents. With this increased availability came the desire for new and exciting foods, and fruit became a symbol of the expanding world and the changing social landscape. As you settle into your own peaceful sleep tonight, consider the role of fresh fruit in the Victorian world. While the Victorians may have seen it as a sign of wealth and sophistication, perhaps we can appreciate the simple pleasure of having access to fresh food whenever we want. Just as the Victorians indulged in seasonal fruits and prized their exotic imports, we too are connected to a global food system that provides us with a bounty of options. But, as we rest tonight, let's not forget the simple joys of a fresh, sweet piece of fruit, just like the Victorians once enjoyed, as a reminder of both luxury and nourishment. As we continue to uncover the details of Victorian breakfasts, we must recognize the immense impact the Industrial Revolution had on daily life, including the way people ate in the morning. The Industrial Revolution transformed Victorian England in countless ways, from the rise of factories to the growth of cities, and this transformation inevitably influenced the kinds of foods that were consumed at breakfast. The shift from agrarian society to urban centers, coupled with the innovations in food production, made breakfast a different kind of event for many, particularly for the working class. Before the Industrial Revolution, breakfast for the working class was often something simple and homemade. Bread, porridge, and tea were common, with food being prepared at home by family members. However, with the rise of industry and the rapid urbanization of England, many people found themselves living in crowded, polluted cities, far from the rural life that had once provided them with fresh, homegrown produce. The demands of factory work meant that many individuals had less time to prepare meals, leading to the rise of ready-made or mass-produced foods. Breakfast was no longer something made from scratch, it became something that could be quickly bought or consumed. The increased availability of processed foods during the Industrial Revolution marked a significant shift in how breakfast was prepared. Foods like canned meats, condensed milk, and pre-sweetened cereals became widely available, making breakfast more convenient, though often less nutritious. The working class, in particular, began relying on these convenient options to feed themselves in the early morning before heading to their factory jobs. While these foods were often cheaper and more accessible, they lacked the nutritional value of fresh, homemade meals. This shift toward convenience was, in part, a reflection of the changing rhythm of life in industrial England. People no longer had the time to sit down to a leisurely meal, as they were rushing off to work in factories or mills. Breakfast, once a slower, more ritualistic meal, became something to be eaten quickly, often standing up or while on the go. The rise of ready-made breakfast foods like tea biscuits, toast with margarine, and even early forms of cereal were tied to the increasing demand for convenience and efficiency in the workplace. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution also led to innovations in food production. The rise of mechanized mills, steam-powered machinery, and refrigeration changed the way food was produced, processed, and distributed. As a result, mass-produced goods became cheaper and more widely available, and breakfast foods were no exception. Innovations like the development of breakfast cereals, such as the first iteration of cornflakes in the late 19th century, offered a quick, easy meal that required little preparation. The advent of commercial sugar production also meant that foods could be sweetened cheaply and consistently, leading to the popularity of sweeter breakfast items. Historians still argue about how these changes affected the health and well-being of the working class. Some scholars argue that the rise of processed foods, while convenient, contributed to the poor diet of industrial workers, leading to issues like malnutrition and poor health. Others point out that the availability of cheap, mass-produced foods allowed more people to access breakfast, something that had once been a luxury for the wealthy. While the food might not have been as nourishing as fresh, homegrown meals, it helped sustain the rapidly growing urban population. What is undeniable, however, is that the Industrial Revolution forever altered the way breakfast was prepared and consumed. The rhythms of work and life in Victorian England had changed, and breakfast, once a leisurely, social occasion, became a rushed and practical necessity for many. This shift set the stage for the modern breakfast culture we know today, where speed, convenience, and mass production have become the norm. As you settle down tonight, think about how our own breakfast routines have evolved, how convenience, time, and access to different kinds of foods have shaped what we eat in the morning. Just as the Victorians adapted to the changing times brought on by industrialization, so too do we adjust to the demands of modern life. And as you rest, remember that while the Industrial Revolution might have sped up the pace of breakfast, the importance of the first meal of the day remains just as essential for fueling us through the busy hours ahead. Now that we've explored how the Industrial Revolution shaped the way the Victorians ate their breakfasts, let's take a closer look at the intricate world of Victorian meal etiquette. The Victorians were known for their strict rules of social conduct, and this extended into every aspect of their lives, including how meals were served and eaten. From the upper crust to the working class, there were codes of behavior to follow when sitting down to a meal. But what did these rules look like at breakfast, and how did they change depending on one's social status? Historians still argue about the intricacies of Victorian meal etiquette, particularly when it came to breakfast. For the upper classes, breakfast was a formal affair. There were proper ways to sit, proper ways to eat, and even proper ways to speak during the meal. The Victorian upper class prided themselves on their refinement, and this was reflected in their breakfast rituals. Men and women would gather around a large table, each person sitting at a precisely set place, often with elaborate china, silverware, and crystal. Every utensil had a designated purpose, and each course was served in a certain order. The food was laid out in a manner that reflected both the wealth of the family and the careful attention to social grace. The first course would often be light, perhaps fruit or an egg dish, before moving on to heavier items like meats, sausages, or fish. The wealthy enjoyed multiple courses, and breakfast could stretch for an hour or more. Conversation flowed, but it was expected to be polite and refined, focusing on matters of business, family, or cultural topics. Breakfast, like all meals in the Victorian upper classes, was as much a social event as it was a way to nourish the body. However, there was also a certain formality about what you could and couldn't do at the breakfast table. For instance, it was considered improper to speak too loudly or interrupt others. Manners dictated that no one should reach across the table for food, instead, everything should be passed along to the person in need. Such rigid rules made every meal an opportunity to display one's knowledge of social decorum and refinement. And as much as breakfast was about sustenance, it was equally about displaying one's position within society. Historians still debate whether these strict rules of etiquette were a sign of genuine social sophistication or if they were merely a reflection of the class divisions of the time. Some argue that these meal rituals were a means of reinforcing the boundaries between the classes, using food as a symbol of social distinction. Others believe that the formalities were an expression of the Victorians' obsession with order and refinement, particularly as a response to the growing industrialization and the perceived loss of social norms. Either way, it's clear that breakfast in the upper classes was more than just a meal, it was a highly stylized, socially significant event. For the working class, breakfast was much simpler, and the rules of etiquette were not as rigid. While manners were still important, there was less emphasis on formality. Meals were often eaten quickly and with little fuss, as the demands of labor took precedence. Still, there were unwritten rules that guided how meals were shared. A family might eat together, with the father typically being the first to sit down, and the children eating quickly so they could head off to work or school. Unlike the leisurely meals of the wealthy, the working-class breakfast was more about efficiency and sustenance than socializing. However, even among the working class, there were codes of behavior that dictated how to behave during meals. It was considered bad form to speak with your mouth full or to be too loud during breakfast. The rise of industrialization meant that time was precious, and eating quickly was often a necessity. Yet, despite the differences between classes, the shared value of propriety and eating habits tied everyone together, from the richest to the poorest. Historians still argue whether these class-based meal etiquettes truly represented the character of the people or if they were merely constructs designed to reinforce social hierarchy. Some believe that the rigidness of meal etiquette in the upper classes was an attempt to assert superiority, while others argue that the rules were simply a reflection of a time when politeness and civility were given great importance. The debate continues, but what remains clear is that breakfast was much more than just a meal for the Victorians. It was a ritual laden with meaning, expectation, and reflection of one's place in society. As you relax into sleep tonight, consider the meal rituals of the past, from the highly formal breakfasts of the upper classes to the practical morning meals of the working class. There's something comforting in knowing that, no matter the formality or simplicity of the meal, breakfast was a time for connection, a time when families, workers, and royalty alike gathered around the table to start the day. Even in the most regimented of social structures, the act of eating together brought people closer, and perhaps, in those quiet moments, they too found a sense of peace, much like you'll find in your own moments of rest tonight. As we move forward in our exploration of Victorian breakfasts, let's pause and consider one of the most enduring and humble foods that became a breakfast staple during the era: porridge. A dish that today might be considered simple or old-fashioned, porridge in the Victorian period was regarded as a nutritious, essential part of many people's breakfast routines. For the working class, it was a standard meal that helped fuel long hours of labor, while for the upper class, it could be dressed up with cream, sugar, or honey, becoming a more indulgent part of the meal. Porridge, often made from oats or barley, was an easy and relatively inexpensive way to fill up and provide much-needed energy to start the day. It was cooked slowly, allowing the grains to swell and soften, forming a warm, comforting dish. For the Victorians, especially those in the working class, a bowl of porridge with milk or a bit of butter was the perfect fuel for the day ahead. It was practical, cheap, and could be prepared quickly, important qualities for a time when many people had busy, labor-intensive jobs. In fact, for many families, porridge was considered the cornerstone of the morning meal. It was not just filling, it was nourishing in a way that worked well with the demands of their physical work. Interestingly, the growing importance of nutrition and health in Victorian society played a key role in elevating porridge's status. The early 19th century saw a rise in the study of nutrition, and medical experts of the time began promoting the value of oatmeal and other grains as part of a balanced diet. Porridge became associated with health and vitality. The idea of eating something simple, yet nourishing, became part of the Victorian ethos of good health, a concept that was gaining traction in a world that was rapidly changing due to industrialization and urbanization. But porridge wasn't the only breakfast food to gain popularity during the Victorian period. The era also saw the rise of commercial breakfast cereals, particularly in the later part of the century. The invention of cereals like cornflakes in the late 19th century marked a significant shift in breakfast culture, as the working class, too, began to enjoy a quick, prepared breakfast. The rise of cereal was, in part, a result of growing industrial production techniques that made processed foods more accessible. These breakfast cereals were often marketed as being both convenient and healthy, offering a new, modern way to start the day. Cereal brands like Kellogg's, founded by John Harvey Kellogg in the 1860s, became increasingly popular in the late Victorian era. While cornflakes and other cereals weren't widely consumed by the upper classes at first, they quickly became popular among the middle and working classes, who sought quick, nutritious options to fuel their busy mornings. The arrival of these packaged foods marked a shift from the traditional, homemade breakfast to something more industrial and convenient, reflecting the broader changes of the Victorian period. Historians still debate whether the rise of cereals was truly a benefit to society's health or if it marked a decline in more traditional, home-cooked meals. Some argue that the mass production of breakfast cereals reflected an increasing reliance on processed foods, which often lacked the nutritional value of their whole food counterparts. Others suggest that cereals, by providing a fast and easy breakfast, helped improve nutrition for the working class, offering them a more affordable and accessible source of sustenance. Whether or not cereals truly transformed breakfast culture in a positive way, one thing is clear: the rise of cereals was part of a broader shift in Victorian society. The increase in industrial production and the availability of processed foods fundamentally changed the way people ate. What was once a homemade, slow-cooked meal became a quick, mass-produced option, a shift that would set the stage for breakfast habits that we still follow today. As you settle into a peaceful rest tonight, think about the humble bowl of porridge or the modern cereal box that represents the evolution of breakfast over time. From the simple nourishment of oats to the mass-produced convenience of cereals, breakfast has always been a reflection of societal change. Just as the Victorians adapted their breakfasts to fit their evolving needs, we too find ways to balance tradition and modern convenience, finding our own comfort in the rituals that shape our days. In the Victorian era, breakfast was not just a meal, it was a social occasion, a time when the upper classes could gather, discuss, and connect. This was especially true for the wealthy, for whom breakfast was a leisurely affair where they could socialize with family, guests, or business associates. The meal was treated almost like an event in and of itself. It wasn't just about eating to sustain the body, it was about positioning oneself within the social framework of the time and reinforcing social relationships. Imagine yourself in the grand dining room of a Victorian estate, the air filled with the sounds of polite conversation and the clink of fine china. The table is adorned with an array of delicious breakfast dishes, eggs, sausages, fresh fruit, perhaps a fish dish or two, and of course, an endless supply of tea. As the meal unfolds, guests are invited to partake in light discussion. Topics range from politics to local news, and occasionally, matters of business or family. Breakfast was often the time for important meetings, especially for men involved in commerce or politics. It was a time to secure deals, catch up on current events, and solidify social ties, all while enjoying the warmth of the morning meal. The leisurely nature of the breakfast ritual also provided an opportunity for women to participate in social life, despite the generally more confined roles they played in public life. Though the social dynamics of the time were often rigid, breakfast allowed for the women of the household to engage with their male counterparts, guests, and visitors in a relaxed, informal setting. While women may not have had the same access to business or political decisions, breakfast gatherings served as an important space for them to be part of the social conversation, reinforcing the importance of family and societal connections. For the working class, however, breakfast was far less about socializing and more about practicality. There were no grand meals shared in the company of friends or business associates. Instead, breakfast was often a rushed affair, eaten in solitude or in the company of family before heading off to work. But even for the working class, there were moments of social interaction during breakfast, perhaps a few words shared with a spouse, a neighbor, or a fellow worker as they hurried through their morning meal. Historians still debate the significance of breakfast as a social occasion, particularly in the context of the working class. Was breakfast a moment for shared community in industrializing England, or was it merely a necessity to fuel the workers for the day ahead? Some argue that even in the working-class breakfast, there were moments of connection, however brief or functional, where people could bond over shared food. Others point out that the rise of factory work and the hustle of modern life led to increasingly fragmented meal times, leaving little room for the social connection that once characterized communal meals. Regardless of the class distinction, the idea of breakfast as a social event was a powerful feature of Victorian society. It was not just about eating, it was about reinforcing relationships, whether personal, familial, or business-related. The Victorian breakfast became a social practice that extended beyond the family table and permeated the world of politics, business, and leisure. In modern times, we've lost some of the ritualistic nature of the Victorian breakfast, but the social aspect of meals remains important. We gather with friends and family for shared meals, and while we might not have the same formality, breakfast still serves as a time to start the day together, whether it's a busy weekday or a leisurely weekend. The connection between food and social interaction remains just as powerful today, albeit in more casual settings. As you settle into your own quiet evening tonight, think of the social connections that meals provide. Whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, food brings people together, just as it did in Victorian times. And while we may not have the same ornate breakfast spreads, we still share in the tradition of connecting with others, starting our days with a shared meal, and taking time to enjoy each other's company, even if that means a quick bite before rushing off to work. Just as breakfast in the Victorian era was about more than just sustenance, our meals today are about connection, conversation, and the quiet comfort of shared experiences. The breakfast habits of the Victorian era have left an indelible mark on our modern morning routines. Though the world has changed dramatically since the days of Queen Victoria, some aspects of the Victorian breakfast tradition continue to influence how we approach our first meal of the day. The leisurely pace of the upper-class breakfast, with its multiple courses and social dynamics, may seem foreign to us today, but its influence can still be seen in the ways we shape our own morning rituals. In fact, the Victorians' careful attention to breakfast as both a meal and a social event helped lay the groundwork for our modern understanding of breakfast and its role in our daily lives. For starters, the very concept of breakfast as a separate, important meal is something we inherited from the Victorians. Before the 19th century, breakfast was often a small, practical meal or simply a snack before the main meal of the day. But by the Victorian era, breakfast had evolved into its own ritual, a time for both nourishment and socializing. The Victorians knew that breakfast wasn't just about feeding the body, it was about setting the tone for the day. This idea of starting the day with intention and purpose continues to resonate with us today, as many of us still prioritize a structured, dedicated breakfast time. The types of foods served for breakfast also saw a lasting influence from the Victorians. The rise of porridge, eggs, bacon, and other hearty breakfast staples during this time laid the foundation for modern breakfast menus. While today's breakfast offerings may be a bit more diverse and accessible, many of the Victorian breakfast favorites are still enjoyed in some form across the world. Porridge, in particular, is a staple in many cultures, and the simplicity and nutritional value of oatmeal continues to be a morning mainstay for many people. Similarly, the ubiquitous pairing of eggs and bacon for breakfast remains one of the most popular breakfast combinations today, a tradition that undoubtedly has its roots in Victorian times. Another lasting impact of Victorian breakfasts is the rise of the modern breakfast beverage, tea. The Victorians elevated tea to a cultural institution, making it a central part of breakfast across all social classes. Tea was no longer just a drink, it became a ritual in itself. The Victorians' appreciation for tea, and their insistence on it being served at breakfast, helped establish it as the quintessential breakfast drink, a status it retains today. Whether you enjoy your tea with milk, sugar, or lemon, the Victorians' love of this beverage continues to shape the way we start our mornings. Even in countries where coffee has taken the lead, tea remains a nostalgic link to the Victorian breakfast tradition. Historians still argue about the extent to which Victorian breakfast culture influenced modern-day eating habits. Some suggest that the formal, elaborate breakfasts of the wealthy were more of a passing social trend, while others argue that the way the Victorians structured and prioritized breakfast laid the foundation for today's breakfast rituals. Regardless of the scholarly debate, there's no denying that the Victorians' careful attention to breakfast, and its role as a socially significant meal, shaped the way we think about the first meal of the day. In fact, many of the breakfast foods and customs that we consider staples, tea, porridge, eggs, and toast, are direct descendants of Victorian tradition. In our modern era, however, we have a very different approach to breakfast. The hustle and bustle of modern life often leads to quicker, more convenient breakfast options. While the Victorian breakfast was an event meant to be savored and shared, today's breakfast is often rushed. Many of us simply grab something on the go or settle for a quick meal at home before heading out for a busy day. This shift in how we approach breakfast reflects the speed and efficiency demanded by modern life. Yet, even in our fast-paced world, we still carry forward the Victorians' emphasis on breakfast as an important and distinct part of our day. As you settle into rest tonight, think about the breakfast ritual in your own life. Whether it's a leisurely meal with family or a quick cup of coffee before heading out the door, your own morning routine carries a thread of continuity that connects you to the traditions of the past. The Victorians, with their emphasis on a structured, meaningful breakfast, helped set the stage for the morning habits we embrace today, reminding us that the way we begin the day still has the power to influence the hours that follow. While Victorian breakfasts were an integral part of daily life, serving as both a social ritual and an opportunity for indulgence, the tradition gradually began to fade in the 20th century. The rise of industrialization, the expansion of the workday, and the changing rhythms of modern life all contributed to the decline of the elaborate Victorian breakfast. As convenience, speed, and efficiency became the hallmarks of the new century, the grand breakfasts enjoyed by the upper classes in Victorian England became a relic of the past. With the dawn of the 20th century, the pace of life began to pick up. Work schedules became more rigid, with the growing dominance of factory work and the 9-to-5 grind. As cities expanded, the leisurely, family-centered breakfasts of the Victorian period gave way to quicker, more practical meals. People didn't have time for long breakfasts with multiple courses, and instead, breakfast became something more functional, a quick meal to fuel the day ahead. The rise of the breakfast cereal industry, which boomed in the early 1900s, played a major role in this shift, providing an efficient, easy-to-prepare alternative to the more elaborate breakfasts of the past. Breakfast cereals, which were marketed as both nutritious and convenient, appealed to the growing number of people working long hours in factories, offices, and homes. These mass-produced foods became the cornerstone of the modern breakfast, replacing the traditional Victorian spread of eggs, meats, and toast with pre-packaged, easy-to-prepare options. The simplicity of cereal, combined with its ability to be consumed quickly, made it an ideal solution for the fast-paced lifestyle that was becoming more common. The decline of the traditional Victorian breakfast wasn't just about convenience, though, it was also about changing social dynamics. The growing influence of feminism and women's rights in the 20th century led to shifts in family roles, including the expectations around meal preparation. In many middle-class homes, women were no longer expected to spend hours preparing extravagant meals for their husbands and children. Instead, breakfast became something that could be prepared quickly, allowing everyone to focus on their work or personal activities. As a result, the communal, slow-paced breakfasts of the Victorian period became less common, and the modern breakfast, often more solitary, hurried, and individual, took its place. Historians still debate the impact of these changes on society. Was the decline of the traditional breakfast a sign of the loss of family-centered rituals, or was it simply a reflection of a society that was becoming more fast-paced and focused on efficiency? Some scholars argue that the shift away from the Victorian breakfast symbolized a break from a time when meals were about connection and leisure, while others suggest that the change was a natural evolution as people sought to balance work, family, and social obligations. For the working class, the decline of the Victorian breakfast also reflected broader changes in food accessibility. The rise of processed and packaged foods, including the growing popularity of breakfast cereals, made breakfast more affordable and accessible to a wider population. However, this shift also meant that the traditional, more labor-intensive foods like porridge and eggs were replaced with quicker options that often lacked the nutritional value of the older breakfast staples. While these new foods made breakfast easier and more accessible, they also represented a shift toward convenience over quality, with the consequences being felt in diet and health in the years to come. As you settle down for sleep tonight, think about how the rhythms of our daily lives shape the way we approach our meals. Like the Victorians before us, we all find ways to balance the demands of life with the need for nourishment, whether we indulge in a long, leisurely breakfast or quickly grab something on the go. The Victorian breakfast tradition, with its emphasis on luxury, social interaction, and indulgence, may be behind us, but its influence still echoes in the way we approach our morning routines. Though the grand tradition of Victorian breakfasts may have faded over the years, its legacy still lingers in modern British culture, particularly in the ways we approach breakfast today. The rituals, the food choices, and the emphasis on breakfast as an important meal of the day have all left their mark, and elements of the Victorian breakfast still influence modern morning routines, especially in England. Whether it's the enduring presence of tea, the love of hearty foods, or even the emphasis on a satisfying meal to start the day, the echoes of the Victorian breakfast remain in our contemporary practices. One of the most enduring aspects of Victorian breakfasts that continues to thrive today is the importance of tea. As we saw, tea was not just a drink, it was the drink of choice, central to the Victorian breakfast table. Even today, in modern England, tea remains synonymous with breakfast. A traditional English breakfast, whether served in a lavish hotel or a cozy home, still revolves around tea. While the specific foods served may have evolved, think of the addition of croissants or fruit juices alongside eggs and bacon, tea remains steadfast as the quintessential morning drink. Additionally, the hearty nature of Victorian breakfasts lives on in modern British breakfasts. The Victorian upper classes might have enjoyed multiple courses of meats, eggs, and pastries, but the modern English breakfast retains much of that richness. The full English breakfast, complete with eggs, bacon, sausages, black pudding, tomatoes, baked beans, and toast, continues to be a beloved staple, particularly on weekends when families have more time to savor the meal. Though the extravagant spreads of the Victorian elite have been dialed down in favor of more practical versions, the love for a filling and satisfying start to the day has endured. Victorian influences also persist in the reverence for tradition and ritual around breakfast. The Victorians, as we've seen, were not just eating, they were participating in a carefully structured social event. In modern times, while the leisurely breakfast of the Victorian elite may not be as common, breakfast remains a significant occasion for many families and friends. Whether it's a quick bite before work or a weekend brunch, the communal aspect of breakfast still holds a certain charm, echoing the Victorian love for shared meals. In some homes, a Sunday breakfast or brunch continues to carry an air of ceremony, perhaps with the same hearty components that were once found on Victorian tables. However, there are also significant changes in how we approach breakfast today, particularly in terms of convenience and health. The rapid pace of modern life has led to breakfast becoming a much quicker, more individualized meal for many people. While the Victorian tradition of a long, leisurely breakfast has been replaced by on-the-go eating habits in much of the world, there's still a connection to the past in how we think about breakfast. For many people, breakfast remains a time for comfort, nourishment, and connection, just as it did in Victorian times, albeit in a different, faster-paced way. The legacy of the Victorian breakfast has persisted in our desire for a satisfying meal, one that provides us with the energy and enjoyment we need to face the day. The rise of health consciousness has also impacted the modern version of the Victorian breakfast. The trend of eating lighter, healthier options in the morning, such as fruits, whole grains, or yogurt, wasn't a part of Victorian breakfast culture, but it certainly influenced today's choices. However, elements of Victorian breakfast indulgence, like the love for rich, hearty dishes, continue to be appreciated as part of British food culture. Modern versions of the Victorian breakfast often include a fusion of old and new foods, blending the traditional with the modern emphasis on healthier options. The Victorian era left a blueprint for how we approach breakfast in England and beyond. While we've moved away from the formality and grandeur of Victorian breakfast rituals, we still hold on to the core idea that breakfast is an essential, often social meal, one that fuels us for the day ahead. Even with the changing times, we continue to celebrate the legacy of Victorian breakfasts through the foods we enjoy and the way we gather together. As you settle into sleep tonight, think about how these breakfast traditions continue to shape our mornings, just as they shaped the routines of those in Victorian England. Whether it's a simple cup of tea or a full spread, breakfast still carries with it the influence of a time when the meal was about more than just food, it was about culture, tradition, and the shared experience of starting the day together. As we come to the end of our journey through the world of Victorian breakfasts, let's pause for a moment to reflect on what these rituals and meals tell us about the society that created them. Breakfast in Victorian England wasn't simply about sustenance, it was a time for indulgence, connection, and, in many ways, the embodiment of class, culture, and personal identity. The grand breakfasts of the wealthy, the simplicity of the working-class meals, and the rise of new breakfast foods all reflect the complexities of Victorian life, with each meal offering insights into the values and aspirations of the time. For the upper classes, breakfast was as much about the spectacle as it was about the food itself. These lavish morning meals were filled with abundant courses, delicate dishes, and social interaction, offering a moment of respite from the often chaotic world of politics, business, and societal expectations. Breakfast was a space where social roles were reinforced and connections were made. The presence of tea, fruit, eggs, and meats was not only about nourishment, it was about showcasing wealth, taste, and refinement. In contrast, for the working class, breakfast was a far simpler affair, less about socializing and more about fueling the body for a day of labor. Yet, even in its simplicity, the working-class breakfast was a crucial part of the daily rhythm, offering a moment of comfort and sustenance before the demands of the day took over. The Victorian era was also a time of transformation. The rise of industrialization, urbanization, and global trade brought about significant changes in how food was produced, consumed, and even perceived. Breakfast foods like porridge, eggs, bacon, and eventually breakfast cereals became part of the fabric of daily life, shaping not only the body but also the emerging ideas of nutrition and health. The shift from home-cooked meals to more mass-produced, convenient options is a direct reflection of the Industrial Revolution's impact on society. And as we've seen, these changes laid the groundwork for the modern breakfast culture we know today. Even though the traditional Victorian breakfast is no longer common in the same grandiose form, its legacy lives on in our contemporary routines. The foods may have changed, but the emphasis on breakfast as an important meal, a time for connection, and an opportunity for self-care remains. Today, we still look to our first meal of the day for energy, comfort, and the rituals that help us navigate the busy hours ahead. While our busy schedules may not allow for the leisurely breakfasts of the Victorian elite, we still find value in taking time for our morning meals, whether we're grabbing a quick bite or enjoying a leisurely weekend breakfast. As you lay down to sleep tonight, think of the Victorian breakfasts, both the opulent feasts and the simpler meals, served in homes across England. Think of the way food was more than just fuel, it was a reflection of social norms, personal identities, and the values of the time. And just as the Victorians found meaning in their meals, so too do we find moments of connection, tradition, and comfort in our own morning rituals. Remember, just like the Victorians, we too are part of a long history of breakfast traditions, shaped by the cultures before us, yet continuing to evolve and reflect who we are today. Let the quiet imagery of Victorian breakfasts fill your mind as you rest tonight, and may you find peace in your own morning routine when you wake, just as they did centuries ago.